Maylin pressed her back against the cold marble wall and stopped breathing. Two men stood just around the corner, speaking in low, fast Chinese, and every word she understood made her heart beat harder. She was not supposed to understand them. Nobody on this estate knew she spoke the language fluently. She had kept that secret since the day she arrived, and now that secret was the only thing standing between her and real danger. It was almost midnight. The kitchen lights were off, the household staff had gone to their quarters, and Maylin had only come back downstairs because she had forgotten her jacket in the laundry room. She never expected to hear anything like this. The two guards, both wearing the black uniform of Richard Vance's private security team, were talking about a shipment that needed to move before dawn, about keeping the paperwork clean, and about making sure nobody asked questions. One of them mentioned money, a lot of money. The other one laughed and said something about the girl at the front gate not being a problem anymore. Maylin's hands trembled. She did not know who the girl at the gate was, but the way he said it made her stomach turn. She waited until their footsteps faded down the hallway before she moved, slow and silent, back toward the servants' stairs. Her jacket could wait. Right now, all she wanted was to disappear into her room and pretend she had heard nothing at all. She was 19 years old, and she had taken this job 3 months earlier because it paid better than anything else she could find. Her mother was sick back home, and every dollar Maylin earned went toward medicine and rent for a small apartment thousands of miles away. She had learned early in life to stay quiet, to work hard, and to never draw attention to herself. That was how she had survived so far in a country where she still felt like a stranger most days. The Vance estate was enormous, the kind of place she had only seen in magazines before she started working there. 12 bedrooms, a private theater, gardens that stretched for acres, and enough staff to run a small hotel. Richard Vance himself was rarely seen by the housekeeping staff. He spent most of his time in meetings, on calls, or traveling for business. The man who actually ran the household day to day was his longtime head of staff, a sharp-eyed man named Marcus Doyle. Marcus hired the guards, managed the schedules, and made all the decisions that Vance never had time for. Everyone on staff understood one simple rule: keep Marcus happy, and you keep your job. Maylin reached her small room on the 3rd floor and closed the door quietly behind her. She sat on the edge of her bed, replaying the conversation in her mind. Shipment, clean paperwork, the girl at the gate. None of it made sense on its own, but together, it felt like pieces of something much bigger than she wanted to imagine. She told herself it was none of her business. She was just the housekeeper. She cleaned floors and folded linens and stayed out of everyone's way. That was the job. That was the whole point of staying invisible. But sleep did not come easily that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard the guard's voice again, calm and casual, like he was talking about nothing more serious than the weather. People who talked about serious things so casually usually had a lot of practice hiding them. The next morning, Maylin went about her chores as if nothing had happened. She vacuumed the long hallway outside the study, dusted the bookshelves in the library, and helped prepare the breakfast trays the way she always did. She kept her eyes down and her voice quiet, just like always. But now she was watching, really watching, in a way she never had before. She noticed the black sedan that arrived at the side entrance around 10 in the morning, the one that never used the main driveway like the delivery trucks or the guests. She noticed how 2 guards walked out to meet it instead of the usual one. She noticed that Marcus came outside himself, something he almost never did, and spoke to the driver through the rolled-down window for nearly 5 minutes before waving the car through the back gate. At lunch, in the small staff kitchen where the household workers ate together, Maylin sat near the window and picked at her food. Across the table, a groundskeeper named Daniel Hale was telling a joke to one of the younger maids, trying to make her laugh. Daniel had been working at the estate longer than almost anyone, nearly 4 years, tending to the gardens and the grounds. He was friendly in a way most of the other staff were not, always ready with a kind word or a bit of harmless humor. But Maylin had also noticed something else about him. He watched things too, quietly, carefully, the same way she did. After lunch, as the others filed out, Daniel lingered by the door. He caught Maylin's eye for a moment longer than necessary. "You look like you didn't sleep," he said. Maylin forced a small smile. "Just tired," she said. "Long week." Daniel studied her for a second, and she had the strange feeling that he could see straight through her answer. He didn't push, though. He just nodded and said, "If you ever need to talk, I'm usually out by the East Garden in the evenings. Nobody bothers me out there." She thanked him and went back to work, but his words stayed with her the rest of the day. "Nobody bothers me out there." It sounded almost like an invitation, or maybe a warning, though she couldn't be sure which. That evening, after her shift ended, Mei-Lin found herself walking toward the East Garden instead of going straight to her room. She told herself she just wanted fresh air. The truth was, she wanted someone to talk to, even if she wasn't ready to say everything she knew. Daniel was there, kneeling beside a row of rose bushes, trimming dead leaves by the fading light. He looked up when he heard her footsteps, but didn't seem surprised to see her. "Couldn't sleep again?" he asked. "Something like that," she said. They talked for a while about small things, the weather, the strange habits of some of the wealthier guests who visited the estate, the way Marcus always seemed to be watching everyone at once. Slowly, carefully, Mei-Lin found herself easing into the conversation. She didn't tell him everything, not yet. She wasn't ready to trust anyone with that much. But she mentioned that she had noticed some odd things happening around the estate lately. Odd cars, odd hours, odd conversations she couldn't quite place. Daniel set down his gardening shears and looked at her seriously. "I've noticed it too," he said. "Been noticing it for months, actually. I just never had anyone to say it to who wouldn't think I was imagining things." Mei-Lin felt something loosen in her chest, a small measure of relief at not being alone with her suspicions anymore. Still, she chose her next words carefully. "What kind of things have you noticed?" she asked. Daniel glanced toward the main house, making sure no one was near enough to hear. "Trucks coming late at night," he said. "Sometimes 2, 3 in the morning. They don't use the front gate. There's a service road on the east side of the property that almost nobody uses, except lately it gets used a lot. And Marcus is always out there when it happens. Every single time." Mei-Lin's pulse quickened. "Do you know what's in the trucks?" she asked. Daniel shook his head. "No idea," he admitted. "I've never gotten close enough to see. The guards make sure of that. But it doesn't feel right. None of it does." They sat in silence for a moment, the last light of evening fading behind the tall hedges. Mei-Lin thought about the conversation she had overheard the night before, the mention of a shipment, the casual cruelty in the guard's voice when he talked about the girl at the gate no longer being a problem. She thought about telling Daniel everything right then, but something held her back. Not distrust exactly, more like fear. Fear of what it would mean if she said the words out loud and made them real. Instead, she simply said, "I think we should be careful. Whatever this is, it's bigger than us." Daniel nodded slowly. "Agreed," he said. "But careful doesn't mean doing nothing. If something wrong is happening in this house, somebody eventually has to say something." His words settled over her like a weight she hadn't asked to carry, but somewhere underneath the fear, she felt a small spark of something else. Purpose, maybe. Or courage, still small and uncertain but real. Mei-Lin returned to her room that night with her mind racing faster than it ever had. She thought about her mother back home, waiting for the money that kept her medicine coming. She thought about her visa, fragile and dependent on this very job, the job she could lose in an instant if she was seen as a troublemaker. And she thought about the girl at the gate, whoever she was, and what it might have meant that she was no longer a problem. She did not know yet what she was going to do. She only knew, lying awake as the house grew silent around her, that she could no longer pretend she hadn't heard what she heard. Whatever was happening at the Vance estate, it was only just beginning to reveal itself. And somehow, without ever meaning to, Mei-Lin had already become a part of it. Outside her window, the East Garden sat quiet and still, but far across the property, near the service road Daniel had mentioned, a pair of headlights blinked once in the darkness before disappearing behind the trees. 3 days passed before Mei-Lin worked up the courage to write anything down. She kept a small notebook hidden inside a rolled pair of socks at the bottom of her dresser drawer, the kind of hiding place that felt silly in daylight but necessary at night. In it, she began recording what she saw. The times the black sedan arrived, the nights the trucks used the service road, the names of the guards she recognized, though she was careful never to write anything that could be traced back to her if the notebook was ever found. She used initials instead of full names, dates instead of details, small marks that would mean nothing to anyone but her. Daniel found her in the garden again on the 4th evening, this time waiting for her instead of the other way around. He had a folded piece of paper in his hand, and when he saw her approaching, he held it out without a word. "What is this?" she asked. "A schedule," he said quietly. "I've been keeping track of the delivery truck. It doesn't come every night, but when it does, it's always between 2 and 4 in the morning, and it's always on a night when Marcus tells the day staff to take the following morning off. Every single time." Maylin looked at the paper, rows of dates and times written in Daniel's neat handwriting. It matched almost exactly with the pattern she had started noticing herself. Seeing it laid out like that, undeniable and precise, made her stomach tighten in a way that no longer felt like simple unease. It felt like fear with a shape to it now, something she could almost reach out and touch. "We need more than a schedule," she said. "We need to know what's actually happening. Otherwise nobody will believe us, and we could lose everything for nothing." Daniel folded the paper again and slipped it into his jacket pocket. "I know," he said, "but getting close enough to find out is risky. If they catch either of us watching, there's no telling what they'll do." Maylin thought again about the words she had overheard that first night, the guard's casual mention of the girl at the gate no longer being a problem. She hadn't told Daniel about that part yet, and she decided the time had come. She recounted the conversation as clearly as she could remember it, watching his face change as she spoke, the easy calm in his eyes replaced slowly by something harder. "That's not just smuggling goods," he said when she finished. "That sounds like something involving people." "I don't know for certain," she admitted, "but it scared me enough that I haven't been able to stop thinking about it since." Daniel was quiet for a long moment, staring toward the dark tree line at the edge of the property. Finally he said, "We should talk to someone. Not the police. Not yet. We don't have proof. But maybe someone inside the house. Someone who isn't part of whatever this is." Maylin considered this. "Who would we even trust?" she asked. "Marcus controls almost everyone here. The guards work for him. Even the other maids report to him through their supervisors." "There's Vance himself," Daniel said slowly, as if testing the idea even as he spoke it. "He's the owner. If Marcus is running something behind his back, Vance would want to know. Wouldn't he?" Maylin almost laughed, though there was no humor in it. "Richard Vance barely knows my name," she said. "I've spoken to him twice since I started working here, and both times it was just him asking me to fetch something. Men like him don't listen to people like us." "Maybe not," Daniel said, "but that doesn't mean we shouldn't try, eventually. Right now, though, I think we need to understand more before we go to anyone. If we're wrong about any part of this, we could destroy our own lives for nothing. If we're right, we need enough proof that nobody can brush it aside." They agreed to keep watching, separately but together, sharing what they learned in these quiet evening meetings by the roses. It became a strange new rhythm to Maylin's days. She would work her shift as she always had, polite and quiet and unremarkable, and then in the evenings she would become someone else entirely, someone paying close attention to every detail of the house she had once tried so hard to blend into. She learned to recognize the sound of Marcus's footsteps on the marble floors, quick and purposeful, always moving with a sense of hidden urgency. She learned which guards rotated through the late shifts, and which ones seemed the most nervous when Marcus was nearby, as though they were afraid of him even while working for him. She began to understand that whatever was happening at the estate, it wasn't something everyone was equally comfortable with. Some of the guards seemed like true believers in whatever scheme Marcus was running. Others looked like men who had gotten in too deep and no longer knew how to get out. One evening, nearly 2 weeks after that first overheard conversation, Maylin was carrying a tray of dishes back toward the kitchen when she passed the study door and heard Marcus's voice from inside, sharp and controlled in a way that made her slow her steps without meaning to. "The shipment gets bigger every month," Marcus was saying. "We need another location. This house can't keep absorbing the volume without someone noticing eventually." A second voice, one Maylin didn't recognize, replied in a low murmur she couldn't quite make out. Marcus responded, his tone sharpening further. "That's not my problem," he said. "My job is logistics. Yours is making sure nobody official ever gets close enough to ask questions. If that girl at the gate had kept her mouth shut, we wouldn't even be having this conversation." Maylin froze completely, the tray trembling slightly in her hands. There it was again, the girl at the gate. She wanted desperately to hear more, but footsteps were approaching the door from inside the study, and she forced herself to keep walking, quickening her pace toward the kitchen before anyone could see her lingering. That night, She told Daniel everything she had heard, word for word as best she could remember it. He listened without interrupting, his jaw tightening as she spoke. Another location, he repeated. That means this isn't just about one shipment. This is something they've built up over time. Something organized. And the girl at the gate, Maylin said. Whoever she was, it sounds like she asked questions she wasn't supposed to ask. Daniel exhaled slowly. We need to find out who she is, he said. Or was. If something happened to her because she noticed too much, that changes everything about how careful we need to be. Maylin nodded, though the thought made her chest tight with fear. She thought of her mother again, of the money she needed to keep sending home, of the very real possibility that pursuing this further could cost her not just her job, but her ability to stay in the country at all. And yet, beneath the fear, something else had begun to grow, a sense that she could not simply look away, now that she knew. Whatever this was, it involved real people, real danger, and she had somehow become one of the few people positioned to do something about it. The next few days brought new pieces of the puzzle. Daniel discovered, through a casual conversation with one of the younger guards who seemed eager for someone to talk to, that there had indeed been another young woman working at the estate several months before Maylin arrived. Her name, as far as the guard remembered, was Katie, and she had worked the front gate checkpoint, verifying visitors and deliveries. According to the guard, Katie had left suddenly one day, no notice, no goodbye, and Marcus had told the rest of the staff she'd simply found a better opportunity elsewhere. Nobody questioned it at the time, Daniel told Maylin later that evening. Staff turnover isn't unusual in a house this size, but now, knowing what we know, doesn't that story sound just a little too convenient? Maylin agreed. It did sound convenient, almost rehearsed, the kind of explanation designed to close a door, rather than answer a question. She thought about what might have happened to Katie, whether she truly had left for a better job, or whether something far more troubling had occurred, and the not knowing frightened her more than almost anything else about this entire situation. Around this same time, Maylin began noticing that one of the guards, a broad-shouldered man named Colin who worked frequent night shifts, had started watching her more closely than the others. It might have been nothing, simple attentiveness that came with his job, but she couldn't shake the feeling that he had noticed her lingering near the study a few too many times, or that he suspected she understood more of what he and his partner discussed in Chinese than she let on. She mentioned her worry to Daniel, and his expression grew serious in a way she hadn't seen before. If they think you understand them, he said, that puts you in real danger. You need to be more careful than ever. Maybe it's time we thought seriously about going to Vance, even without everything wrapped up neatly. But we still don't have proof, she reminded him. Just things we've heard, things we've noticed. It's not enough. Maybe not for the police, Daniel said, but it might be enough to make Vance start looking at his own house differently. Sometimes that's all it takes, someone planting the first seed of doubt. Maylin wasn't sure she agreed, but she also wasn't sure what other options remained. The days were beginning to feel heavier, each one bringing new small signs that the danger around her was growing rather than shrinking. She thought of the trucks on the service road, of Marcus's cold voice discussing shipments like they were nothing more than boxes of merchandise, of a young woman named Katie who had vanished from the estate without so much as a proper goodbye. Whatever this was, it had already claimed at least one person's place in this house, quietly and without consequence. Maylin lay awake that night, wondering how many more secrets the walls of the Vance estate were hiding, and how much longer she and Daniel could keep gathering pieces of the truth before someone noticed they were looking. Outside, far past the rose garden and the manicured lawns, the service road sat dark and waiting, ready for whatever the next shipment would bring. Richard Vance had built his fortune on trust, though not the kind most people imagined when they thought of a self-made billionaire. He trusted numbers, patterns, and the instincts he'd sharpened over 20 years of business decisions that had made him one of the wealthiest men in the country. What he did not trust, or rather what he never thought to question, was the small circle of people he had surrounded himself with at home. Marcus Doyle had been with him for over a decade, hired back when Vance's fortune was a fraction of what it had become, and in all that time, Marcus had never given him a single reason to doubt his loyalty. He managed the house, the staff, the security, the schedules, all of it, freeing Vance to focus entirely on his company and the endless demands of running it. It was this very trust, absolute and unquestioned, that had created the blind spot now growing dangerously wide beneath his own roof. Vance rarely walked the halls of his own home after dark. He rarely noticed which staff came and went, which trucks used which roads, or why his head of security seemed to grow more tense with each passing week. He was a man who had learned to delegate everything, and in doing so, he had unknowingly handed control of his entire domestic world to a man now using that control for something far darker than household management. Maylin knew none of this directly, of course. She only knew what she observed from the edges of the house, the places where wealthy men like Vance never thought to look. But as the days passed, she began to piece together not just what Marcus was doing, but how completely he had positioned himself to do it without anyone noticing, least of all the man who employed him. It was Daniel who first suggested they needed to understand Marcus's operation more fully before approaching anyone with what they knew. If they went to Vance with vague suspicions and no clear picture, Marcus would simply explain it away, and they would be the ones who ended up looking foolish, or worse, disloyal. Vance trusted Marcus completely. Breaking that trust would require more than whispers and half-heard conversations. So they kept watching, more carefully now than ever. Maylin began paying closer attention to the guest logs she sometimes helped organize, cross-referencing names with the strange nighttime deliveries Daniel continued tracking. She noticed that several of the names appearing most frequently belonged to men who visited the estate under the guise of business meetings with Vance, though Vance himself was rarely present during their actual visits. Instead, these men would meet privately with Marcus, in a small office near the West Wing, a room technically used for household administration, but increasingly serving another purpose entirely. One of these men, a heavy-set visitor who arrived every second Thursday like clockwork, caught Maylin's attention more than the others. His name in the guest log was recorded simply as Mr. Feng, no company listed, no clear reason for his visits noted anywhere. She mentioned him to Daniel, and together they began watching for his arrivals, trying to understand what business could possibly require such regular, unexplained meetings. It was during one of Mr. Feng's visits that Maylin overheard something that changed the shape of everything she thought she understood. She had been asked to bring refreshments to the small office near the West Wing, an errand she normally would have handed off to another staff member, but this time she volunteered herself, driven by a mixture of fear and determination she hadn't quite named yet. As she approached the door with the tray, it was open just enough for her to hear Marcus's voice clearly from inside. "The numbers keep climbing," he was saying. "Vance thinks the increased shipping costs are from the expansion into the new markets. He doesn't look closely enough to see what's actually moving through those numbers." Mr. Feng's voice, calm and measured, replied in Chinese, a language Maylin understood perfectly, even as she kept her expression carefully blank. He asked whether Vance would ever look closely enough to notice, and Marcus laughed, a short, humorless sound. "Never," he said. "That's the beauty of using his company. Nobody questions a legitimate business moving legitimate cargo. We're using his own success as cover, and he doesn't even know it." Maylin's hands went cold around the tray she carried. It wasn't just happening at the house. It was happening through Vance's actual company, his shipping and logistics operations, hidden inside legitimate business the same way a splinter hides inside skin, invisible until it caused real pain. She knocked softly on the door, giving herself a moment to compose her expression before entering, and set the tray down without meeting anyone's eyes, exactly as she had trained herself to do 100 times before. Neither man paid her any real attention as she left, which told her everything about how invisible she truly was to them, and for the first time, she was grateful for that invisibility, rather than resentful of it. She found Daniel later that evening in his usual spot by the roses, and told him everything. He listened in silence, his face growing paler as she spoke, and when she finished, he sat back on his heels and stared out at the darkening garden for a long moment before speaking. "This is bigger than either of us imagined," he said finally. "If they're using Vance's actual shipping company, this isn't just some side operation happening behind his back. It's built directly into his business. That means the paper trail, if there even is one, would be buried somewhere inside his own company's records. Which means," Maylin said slowly, "that even if we go to him now, he might not believe us without proof he can actually see. Words alone won't be enough, not against someone he's trusted for 10 years. Daniel nodded grimly. "And there's something else," he said. "If Marcus is confident enough to talk about this so openly, Even to someone he thinks is invisible, he's not worried about getting caught. That kind of confidence usually means he has people watching for exactly the kind of thing we're doing. We can't assume we're as invisible as we feel right now. The warning settled over Mei Lin like a chill she couldn't shake. She thought of Colin, the guard who had started watching her more closely, and wondered again whether he suspected something. She had tried to convince herself it was simple attentiveness, nothing more. But now, with Daniel's words echoing in her mind, that explanation felt thinner than ever. Over the following days, Mei Lin noticed small things that made her increasingly uneasy. Her schedule was changed without explanation, moving her from the West Wing, where she had access to the small office and the areas near the study, to the East Wing, where the guest bedrooms sat mostly empty during the week. When she asked about the change, the household supervisor simply said Marcus had requested it, offering no further explanation. It felt less like a coincidence and more like a message, though she couldn't be certain what that message was meant to convey. Daniel, too, began noticing shifts in his own routine. His usual gardening hours in the evening were suddenly moved earlier, cutting short the quiet time he and Mei Lin had used to share what they'd learned. When he asked about it, he was told it was simply for efficiency, nothing more. Neither of them believed it. "We need to be smarter about how we talk," Daniel said one afternoon, catching Mei Lin briefly near the laundry room, the only moment their new schedules seemed to overlap. "If they're watching us, meeting in the garden every evening isn't safe anymore." Mei Lin agreed, though the idea of losing even that small, quiet space where she felt she could speak freely filled her with a fresh wave of loneliness. They agreed to communicate more carefully after that. Brief exchanges during work hours, notes left in places only they would think to check, small signals that wouldn't draw attention even if someone was watching closely. It was during this tense, careful period that Mei Lin finally learned more about what had happened to Katie, the young woman who had once worked the front gate. She learned it from an unexpected source, a delivery driver named Peter, who occasionally brought supplies to the kitchen and had struck up an easy friendship with some of the kitchen staff over the months. During one delivery, while Mei Lin helped carry boxes inside, Peter mentioned offhand that he used to see a young woman at the gate checkpoint who always waved him through with a smile, and that he'd been surprised one day to find her simply gone, replaced by someone new who barely looked up from a clipboard. "Did you ever hear what happened to her?" Mei Lin asked, trying to keep her voice casual. Peter shrugged. "Heard she got into some kind of trouble," he said. "Nothing specific, just office talk. One of the other guards told me she asked too many questions about a truck that came through without proper paperwork, and after that, she just wasn't around anymore. Figured she got fired. Or worse," Mei Lin thought, though she said nothing aloud. She thanked Peter for the boxes and carried them inside, her mind turning over this new piece of the puzzle. Katie had asked questions about a truck without proper paperwork, the very kind of truck Mei Lin and Daniel had been tracking for weeks now, and shortly afterward, she had vanished from the estate entirely. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore, and impossible to explain away as coincidence. That night, in a note passed briefly between them during a rare unsupervised moment near the supply closet, Mei Lin wrote to Daniel, "We need to find out what happened to Katie. If we can find her, or find out for certain what happened to her, it might be the proof we need." Daniel wrote back the following day, his note simple and direct. "I know someone who might help. Give me a few days." True to his word, within a week Daniel returned with news. Through a contact from his years working at the estate, someone who had once worked alongside Katie briefly before she disappeared, he learned that Katie had, in fact, left the state entirely, moving back in with family several hours away, after what she described only as a bad situation at her old job. She was alive, thankfully, though shaken enough by whatever had happened that she refused to discuss the details even with old friends who reached out to check on her. "She's scared," Daniel said, relaying what he'd learned. Whatever happened, it scared her enough to leave everything behind, rather than risk staying and pushing back. Mei Lin felt a strange mixture of relief and renewed fear at this news. Relief that Katie was alive, that whatever had happened to her had not been the worst possibility Mei Lin had imagined, but fear too, because it confirmed that people who noticed too much at the Vance estate did not simply lose their jobs quietly. They were frightened into silence, pushed out before they could cause any real trouble, and the operation continued undisturbed beneath the surface of Richard Vance's unknowing trust. "We can't end up like her," Daniel said quietly. scared into hiding, unable to do anything. If we're going to act, we need to act carefully, and we need to act soon, before they decide we've noticed too much as well. Maylin agreed, though the weight of what lay ahead pressed down on her more heavily than ever. They had learned enough now to understand the shape of what was happening. Wealthy business used as cover, a trusted employee betraying that trust for personal profit, and at least one person already frightened into silence to protect the operation. What they still lacked was proof solid enough to convince a man like Richard Vance that the empire he had built could be hiding something so corrupt beneath its polished surface, and they lacked any clear plan for how to deliver that proof without becoming the next people to simply disappear from the household staff roster. As the days grew shorter and the pressure grew heavier, Maylin found herself thinking more and more about the moment that would eventually come, the moment when silence was no longer an option, and someone would have to speak the truth directly to the man who held all the power in that house, whether he was ready to hear it or not. The moment arrived sooner than either of them expected, and not in the way they had planned. Richard Vance was hosting a dinner for a group of business partners and investors, the kind of event that happens several times a year at the estate, filling the main dining hall with important guests and requiring nearly every household staff member to work well into the night. Maylin had been assigned to help serve the meal, moving quietly between the long table and the kitchen, refilling glasses and clearing plates with the practiced invisibility she had perfected over months of careful observation. Daniel, though not usually needed for indoor events, had been called in to help manage the outdoor lighting along the garden paths where some guests liked to walk between courses. The evening moved along as such evenings always did. Polite conversation, expensive wine, careful laughter that never quite reached anyone's eyes. Maylin noticed Marcus circulating through the room as well, more present at this event than he usually was at smaller gatherings, speaking quietly with several of the guests she now recognized from the guest logs she had studied so carefully. Among them, seated near the head of the table, was Mr. Feng, dressed impeccably and smiling with the easy confidence of a man who had never once worried about being caught. Something about seeing him there, so comfortable and welcome in Vance's own home, sitting just feet away from the man whose company he was quietly using for his own corrupt purposes, ignited something in Maylin she hadn't quite expected. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was anger, sharp and sudden, at the sheer arrogance of it all, at the casual way these men had built their scheme on the back of someone else's trust and success. She found Daniel briefly near the kitchen entrance during a lull in service and told him, in a hurried whisper, that Mr. Feng was seated at the dinner table itself, treated like an honored guest rather than the man they now believed was at the center of a corrupt operation running through Vance's own company. Daniel's face went tight. "That's insane," he said, sitting right there like nothing's wrong. "Because as far as anyone else knows, nothing is wrong," Maylin said. "Nobody sees what we've seen. Nobody knows what we know." Daniel was quiet for a moment, and Maylin could see something shifting behind his eyes, a decision forming that frightened her even before he spoke it aloud. "Maybe it's time somebody did," he said. Before Maylin could respond, before she could remind him of every careful plan they had discussed, every reason to wait until they had solid proof, Daniel was already moving back toward the dining hall. She followed a step behind, her heart pounding, unsure whether to pull him back or simply brace herself for whatever was about to happen. The dining hall was mid-course when Daniel entered, stepping past the other staff members with a determination that immediately drew several curious glances. Richard Vance was standing near the head of the table, glass raised, in the middle of a toast to a successful quarter and the partnerships that had made it possible. It was, of all moments, the worst possible time to interrupt, and yet Daniel walked directly toward him anyway, stopping just close enough to be heard clearly across the suddenly quiet room. "Mr. Vance," Daniel said, his voice steady despite the visible tension in his shoulders. "I need to say something, and I know this isn't the time, but I don't think there's ever going to be a better one." The room fell into a stunned silence. Vance lowered his glass slowly, his expression shifting from confusion to something harder as he took in the situation. A groundskeeper interrupting a formal toast in front of his most important business partners. "Whatever this is," Vance said, his voice controlled but sharp, "it can wait until morning." "I don't think it can," Daniel said. "You trust Marcus with everything in this house. But something has been happening here that you don't know about. Something involving your company, your shipments, and people who have gotten hurt because they noticed too much." Gasps rippled quietly through the seated guests. Marcus, standing near the far end of the table, had gone pale, his eyes darting first toward Daniel and then toward Mr. Feng, whose expression remained carefully unreadable, despite the sudden tension in the room. Vance's face flushed with anger and embarrassment in equal measure. "This is not the place," he said, his voice rising now. "You're finished here. Get out before I have you removed." The words landed like a blow, but Daniel didn't move, didn't back down, standing his ground even as two guards began moving toward him from the edges of the room. It was in that moment, watching Daniel about to be dragged away and dismissed, his warning about to be buried along with every other inconvenient truth this house had swallowed, that Mei Lin finally stepped forward. "Wait," she said, her voice smaller than she wanted it to be, but clear enough to cut through the tension. "He's telling the truth." Every eye in the room turned toward her now. The quiet housekeeper nobody had ever paid much attention to, suddenly standing in the center of everyone's focus. Her hands trembled at her sides, but she forced herself to keep speaking, the fear that had kept her silent for weeks, finally giving way to something stronger. "I heard the guards talking," she said. "Not once, several times, in Chinese. They didn't know I understood them. They talked about shipments, about keeping paperwork clean, about a girl who used to work the front gate who asked too many questions, and then disappeared. I found out later she left because she was frightened enough to leave her whole life behind, rather than keep working here." Vance stared at her, his anger faltering slightly beneath the weight of what she was saying, though confusion and disbelief still colored his expression. Marcus took a step forward, his voice tight with forced calm. "Sir, this is absurd," he said. "She's clearly confused. Maybe misunderstood something she overheard. I can explain everything. If you'll just—" "I'm not confused," Mei Lin interrupted, surprising herself with the steadiness that had suddenly found its way into her voice. "I heard Marcus himself say that your company's shipping numbers were being used to hide something. I heard him say nobody questions legitimate cargo moving through a legitimate business. I heard him say it directly to the man sitting at your table right now." She turned, meeting Mr. Feng's eyes for the first time since she'd begun speaking. His expression had shifted from unreadable calm to something far more guarded, and in that shift, Mei Lin saw confirmation of everything she and Daniel had pieced together over the past weeks. "Say something in Chinese to prove I'm wrong," she said, her voice steady despite the enormity of what she was doing. "Say it right now, in front of everyone, and let them hear how easily you both switch between languages depending on who you think is listening." The silence that followed felt endless. Mr. Feng said nothing. Marcus said nothing. And in that silence, something in Richard Vance's expression finally began to change, the anger and embarrassment giving way slowly to something far more dangerous, a dawning understanding of just how deeply he might have been deceived inside his own home, by the very people he had trusted most completely. "Everyone," Vance said finally, his voice quiet now, stripped of its earlier authority. "Please excuse us for a moment." The guests exchanged uneasy glances but said nothing, several of them rising quietly to step into the adjoining sitting room as instructed. Marcus remained where he stood, his composure cracking further with each passing second, while Mr. Feng's chair scraped back slightly, as though he were calculating whether this was the moment to make an exit. "Nobody leaves this room," Vance said sharply, and to Mei Lin's surprise, one of the guards nearest the door, a younger man she didn't recognize well, moved to block it without hesitation, as though even among the security staff, loyalty to Marcus's operation had never been universal. Vance turned to Mei Lin and Daniel, his expression a mixture of disbelief, anger, and something that looked almost like shame. "Tell me everything," he said. "Right now, every single detail, and don't leave anything out." And so, standing in the middle of his own dining hall, with his most trusted employee and one of his business partners frozen in place under the weight of exposure, Mei Lin began to speak, telling Richard Vance the full truth for the first time. The truth she had carried quietly and carefully for weeks, terrified of exactly this moment, and yet somehow, now that it had finally arrived, feeling only a fierce and steady relief that the silence, at last, was over. By the time she finished speaking, nearly 20 minutes had passed. Daniel filled in details she had missed, the schedule of trucks, the sudden changes to their work hours, the story of Katie's disappearance confirmed through the delivery driver's account. Vance listened without interrupting, his face growing paler with every new detail, the picture assembling itself into something he could no longer dismiss as confusion or misunderstanding. When they finished, the dining hall remained silent, except for the quiet, uneasy shifting of the few staff members still present. Vance turned slowly toward Marcus, and for a long moment, he simply looked at him, as though trying to reconcile the man he had trusted for 10 years with the man now standing accused in his own home. "Is any of it true?" Vance asked, his voice quiet in a way that felt far more unsettling than shouting would have. Marcus opened his mouth, closed it again, and for the first time since Mei Lin had known him, seemed to have no ready answer prepared. The silence stretched long enough to become its own kind of confession. Vance did not wait for a verbal admission. He turned to the younger guard still standing near the door and instructed him to make sure neither Marcus nor Mr. Feng left the property, then asked another staff member to call the authorities immediately. The remaining dinner guests, gathered nervously in the adjoining room, were informed that the evening had come to an early and unusual end, and most left quietly, understanding without needing to be told that they had witnessed something far more serious than an awkward interruption. The following hours unfolded in a blur for Mei Lin. Investigators arrived within the hour, first local officers and then, once the scope of the operation became clearer, federal agents who specialized in exactly the kind of cross-border smuggling scheme Marcus had built, using Vance's shipping company as cover. Mei Lin and Daniel were both questioned extensively, their careful notes and observations suddenly transforming from a hidden notebook and a folded schedule into critical pieces of evidence supporting a much larger investigation already forming around Mr. Feng and his associates. It turned out that the shipments Marcus had been managing involved counterfeit goods worth millions of dollars, moved consistently through Vance's legitimate shipping routes over the course of nearly 2 years. Investigators later confirmed that Katie's abrupt departure had indeed been the result of intimidation, frightening threats delivered quietly enough that she never felt safe reporting them, choosing instead to simply disappear from the situation entirely. When investigators reached out to her following Marcus's arrest, she finally felt safe enough to confirm everything Mei Lin and Daniel had pieced together, adding her own account to the growing case against him. Richard Vance cooperated fully with the investigation, opening his company's records completely and expressing, in every conversation Mei Lin overheard in the days that followed, a genuine and deepening horror at how completely he had been deceived within his own home. He had built an empire on careful attention to numbers and patterns in his business, yet had never thought to apply that same scrutiny to the people managing his household, the very place he considered his refuge from the pressures of that business. It was a hard lesson, and Mei Lin could see it weighing on him in the days that followed, a humility that hadn't been present in him before that night. Marcus was arrested that same evening, along with Mr. Feng and several of the guards who had knowingly participated in the operation. Colin, the guard who had made Mei Lin so uneasy in the preceding weeks, was among those taken into custody, and learning this brought her a relief so profound she hadn't realized how much fear she had been carrying until it finally lifted from her shoulders. In the weeks that followed, the estate slowly returned to something resembling normal, though nothing about it felt quite the same as before. Vance called Mei Lin and Daniel into his study one afternoon, the same study where so many of the conversations that had started this entire ordeal had taken place. He looked different than she remembered from those brief early encounters, less distant, more present, as though the events of that night had cracked something open in him that allowed him to see the people around him more clearly. "I owe you both more than I know how to say," he told them, his voice carrying a sincerity that surprised Mei Lin after months of feeling invisible within these walls. "You risked everything to tell me something I should have noticed myself, in my own home, and instead it took 2 people I barely knew to show me what I'd missed." He offered Daniel a permanent promotion, overseeing not just the grounds but the broader security and integrity of the estate itself, a role built specifically around making sure nothing like this could ever happen again unnoticed. Daniel accepted, visibly moved by the offer, though he made clear that he saw it as a partnership rather than a solo responsibility, one that would only work with Mei Lin's continued involvement as well. To Mei Lin, Vance offered something she hadn't dared to hope for, a permanent position within the household, one with real security and real respect, along with something far more valuable than any job title. He connected her with immigration lawyers who helped stabilize her visa status, ensuring she would no longer live under the constant fear of losing everything over a single misstep or misunderstanding. More than that, He personally helped arrange for her mother to travel to the country for proper medical treatment, covering costs that would have taken Mei-Lin years to save on her own. "I can't fix everything that happened here," Vance told her quietly during that same conversation, "but I can make sure the person who had the courage to speak up, even when speaking up, could have cost her everything, never has to be afraid again in this house." Mei-Lin left that meeting with a feeling she hadn't experienced in a very long time, something like safety, real and solid, rather than the fragile, uncertain kind she had learned to live with since arriving in the country. That evening, she walked out to the East Garden one more time, the place where so many quiet, frightened conversations had slowly built into something that had finally changed everything. Daniel was already there, sitting on the low stone bench near the roses, and he smiled when he saw her approaching, an easy, genuine smile that no longer carried the weight of secrets between them. "We did it," he said simply, as she sat down beside him. "We did," she agreed. For a while, neither of them said anything else, content simply to sit together in the quiet evening air, listening to the wind move gently through the garden that had once felt like the only safe place in a house full of hidden danger. The service road beyond the tree line sat dark and empty now, no longer waiting for shipments that should never have existed, and somewhere far across the property, the front gate stood open in the evening light, no longer guarding secrets, simply welcoming whoever came and went with nothing left to hide. Mei-Lin thought of her mother, soon to arrive in a country that had once felt so unwelcoming, and now, finally, felt like it might truly become home. She thought of Katie, safe somewhere far away, finally able to breathe without looking over her shoulder. And she thought of herself, the quiet girl who had once tried so hard to disappear into the background of other people's lives, now standing at the center of a truth that had changed everything, not just for her, but for everyone who had ever been silenced by fear inside those walls. She had heard the guard speaking Chinese on an ordinary night that felt like any other, and in that single overheard moment, everything about her life had quietly, irrevocably begun to change.